Welcome to the sixth lecture in our series, Africa. Tonight will be a real change of pace for us. No more history and anthropology. Tonight we have music. And we're fortunate indeed to have Kofi Agawu as our musical guide. A native of Ghana, Professor Agawu completed his undergraduate education in England, earning a BA from Reading University and a master's in music from King's College London. After receiving his PhD from Stanford, he taught at Cornell and Yale before joining Princeton's music department in 1998. In addition, he's an adjunct professor at the University of Ghana. Professor Agawu is a rarity in the world of music in that he is equally fluent in classical European music and in African music. For most people, these are two radically different forms. For Professor Agawu, however, they are fused and have equal significance for him as a scholar, a listener, and a one-time aspiring composer. Selections from his publications bear this out. They range from Stravinsky's Mass and Stravinsky Analysis, to The Invention of African Rhythm, to Prolonged Counterpoint in Mahler. Should I admit that I, for one, am pleased that tonight we're hearing African music. We fully expect that the examples he'll share with us tonight will come through the auditorium sound system, but as a seasoned speaker, he brought a backup CD in case that doesn't work. Now let's continue our wonderful Tuesday night visits to Africa and explore the rhythmic imagination in African music with Professor Kofi Agawu.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I have a somewhat gentle voice, so. Okay.
Give it another try.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yes. I can hear myself, actually, which is strange. So the rhythmic imagination in African music. I thought I should just say something about some of the work that I've done on African music, since this is a scholarly audience. There are two books that I wrote, one in 1995 called African Rhythm and Northern Ewe Perspective. And it's a book about rhythmic expression among the Northern Ewe people of Ghana, and the eastern part of Ghana. And then more recently, I wrote a book called Representing African Music, Postcolonial Notes, Queries, and Positions. And that's a book, it's a slightly polemical book. It takes issue with some of the views, the commonly circulated views about Africa, everything from rhythmic dominance to various aspects, various sort of technical things that scholars have talked about. So that's sort of where I'm situated, so to speak. But anyway, just to begin here, what this lecture is about. This lecture is about African music, and specifically about rhythm. And music, some people have said, is organized sound, or if you like what John Blacking, the British ethnomusicologist, says, they're sounds organized into humanly acceptable patterns. Actually, I don't know. I mean, in Africa, we take it for granted that they should have human significance. I don't know about these parts of the world. But Blacking, as I said, was a British ethnomusicologist, and he did his work among the Venda in the northern part of now present-day South Africa. And he was very keen to establish the sort of deep sense in which music is imbricated in social processes. So one of the reasons that he defined music as sounds organized into humanly acceptable patterns was so he could fantasize a soundly organized humanity. You see? This is sort of where he was going. But this was in the 60s and 70s. I guess we don't have those fantasies anymore. Anyway, just to draw your attention by way of parenthesis to what may strike you as a significant absence, there's actually no word for music in most of the indigenous African languages. So if you spoke Ewe with me, we could not say, let's discuss music today. This would not be possible. There is no word for rhythm in most of the indigenous African languages either. So we could not have a lecture like this in my native language, Siwo. I wouldn't know what to describe as the rhythmic imagination. I would have to substitute various words. So I think these are significant lexical absences. And what they point to is a different arrangement of priorities for African subjects when it comes to thinking about what you call music or what you call rhythm. There are, however, words for things like language, for speaking, words for voice, for song, for poem, for drum, for dance, and various performance actions. One of my favorites actually is the word for poem in Ewe, which is hakpanya. Hakpanya means words for carving song. So a poem is already on its way to becoming a song. Anyway, so all I'm saying here is that what I'm calling a significant absence of words for music and for rhythm, just those two, suggest that the elements of what we call music might be aligned differently in African communities. Now, why is music important? Well, quite simply because, as far as we know, there is no known human community that doesn't have music, language, or religion. These three seem to be found everywhere where communities gather. Now, in Africa, one would say that there are three kinds of music, or three sort of broad categories of music. This is what I tell my students anyway. One category is what we might call traditional music. A second we might call popular music. And a third we might call art music. Now, the music that I want to talk about tonight is traditional music. Traditional music you might think of as those numerous repertoires of song and instrumental music that originate in specific African communities, are performed regularly as part of play, ritual, and worship, and circulate mostly orally and orally, A-U-R-A, within and across language, ethnic, and cultural boundaries. So this is the music that we think is characteristically African, or at least that escapes, if you like, the influence of Europe. Now, popular music and art music, which I will not talk about today, are more modern inventions. Popular music is a deliberately hybrid genre that mixes European instruments and harmonic and melodic resources with African instruments, ideational themes, and so on. And art music is Africa's response to the European tradition of classical music from Bach to Bartok, if you like. And there are people actually on the African continent who are writing symphonies and cantatas and so on. You never hear about them because the ethnomusicologists and the anthropologists don't want you to hear about them. But there are such people. In fact, I will play you a couple of pieces in that realm, even though I said I wouldn't, but I will, just to make the point. Okay, so the music that I want to talk about is traditional African music, music of ostensibly pre-colonial origin. Now, it is not necessarily the music that reaches you here in the West because it is so deeply bound up with ritual and especially language that it's sometimes harder to transmit. Even within Africa, traditional music is not the music that you would put on radio or on TV because if you don't speak that language, then a great deal of what is conveyed in the music will be lost to you. So you can see that if I'm Ewe speaking and there's a Ga song and I don't understand Ga, then I'll lose out on that. It's much better to play popular music, which is in some sort of pidgin, English or in some sort of French, which is accessible to the rest of us. So I'm saying even on the African continent, the transmission of this music is limited. That is to say that the music is very much bound within the communities that it originates. Okay, so just one more preliminary before we start playing some music. Music, as you know, of course, has several dimensions, and in the West, generally people talk of melody, harmony, polyphony, timbre, tone, color, rhythm, among others. Now, the aspect of African music that I've chosen to focus on is rhythm. Rhythm being understood here as the general time aspect of music, or the general temporal aspect of music. Now, rhythm involves many things. It involves duration, how long notes last. It involves accent, ways in which notes are marked for consciousness. It involves meter, which is a mechanism, if you like, for grouping notes according to their relative strength or weakness. And then it involves something that you might call grouping, which are formations of notes into morphologies, not based on a recurring accentual scheme. Some of this can get technical, and I can explain during the discussion if something is not clear. And why African rhythm? Well, for the very simple reason that many people think, that is to say, it is commonly believed in both the popular imagination and among specialists that the essence or the distinctive trait of African music lies in its rhythmic character. I thought you'd be amused to hear some of what has been said about African rhythms. I'm just going to read out some quotes to you, starting happily in the 11th century. This is an Arabic source, and it says, and I quote, that if a black were to fall from the sky to the earth, he would fall in rhythm. Whew, even in doing something as dangerous as that. Okay. Here's another one, a German comparative musicologist by the name Erich von Hornbostel, writing in 1928, who says African music is syncopated past comprehension. That's the end of that. So complexity, but you can't really understand it. Yeah. But he understands enough to know that you can't understand it. Yeah. Here's one from W.E.F. Ward, who was a historian who worked in various parts of Africa. I have to say, I'm proud to say that I met Ward actually before he passed away, sometime in the 1980s. And here's what he says. Quote, the basis of African rhythm is so completely different from that of Europeans that the European system of bar lines is foreign to African music. Africans have not merely cultivated their sense of rhythm far beyond ours, but must have started with a superior sense of rhythm. That's the end of that. Here's one from one of the most enthusiastic writers about African music. He's an Englishman by the name A.M. Jones. He spent 22 years in what was the northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, as a missionary. And he came back to the UK as an expert on African music. And as I said, wrote very enthusiastically. You could just see things bubbling from his pages. And so here's an example of the kind of thing Jones said, quote, if anyone were to ask what is the outstanding characteristic of African music, the answer is a highly developed rhythm. The African is far more skilled at drumming rhythms than we are. In fact, our banal pom-pom-pom on the drums is mere child's play compared with the complicated and delicate interplay of rhythms in African drumming. That's the end of that quote from Jones. Now, you may think these are just older quotations that I pulled out from an 11th century source, earlier 20th century sources. No, it gets worse. And it's not just Europeans. Let me just give you one more European thing. This next one, because it actually touches on a technical issue that I'll be talking about later on. This is one Reverend Dr. Brian Kinslake. He's writing around 1960, and he is actually reviewing a book by A.M. Jones. And he has this to say. He says, A.M. Jones's book introduces us into a strange, enchanted world of pure sound. Once the language starts to get mystical, you know what's coming. Into a strange, enchanted world of pure sound, made up almost entirely of complex patterns of rhythm and gong taps. To call these complex is an understatement. The very thought of them makes one dizzy. Imagine two drummers playing together in cross rhythm, 3 against 2. Now, stagger them so that they are out of phase. Now, add 2 other drummers and a singer and clap accompaniment, all rhythmically at cross purposes and out of phase with one another. That's the end of that quote. Okay. So he's trying to get at something technical, and I think, you couldn't get many more errors in what actually happens in ensemble music than that. But it's an honest attempt to come to terms with what he had heard in Nigeria. Here is Kwabnan Ketia, one of the most distinguished African writers writing about African music. He thinks that the parameters, the parameters of music are often arranged in kind of in compensation. So, God gives some people harmony and gives some people rhythm. We got rhythm, but we didn't get the other stuff. So here's what he says. Since African music is predisposed towards percussion and percussive textures, there is an understandable emphasis on rhythm. For rhythmic interest often compensates for the absence of melody or the lack of melodic sophistication. That's the end of that quote. It's an extraordinary claim about the ostensible primitive nature of our melodic resources, just because we have lots of rhythm or lots of good rhythm. That's Nketiah, an African writer. But you get the flavor, I think, of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So while those quotations are ringing in your ears, so to speak, let me turn to some music. So I'm going to play you a first example, which is, I think, the kind of quintessential traditional African music. When people are talking about traditional African music, this is the kind of sound they're thinking about. This is a Southern Ewe dance. It's called Agbaja, and I'll just play it so you get a feel or you get a sort of taste of the sound here. Sorry. So I'm surprised to see you sitting so still. It's a very strange experience for me. Well, what's going on here? The ethos of the music. There is life in this music. The ethos is communal and participatory. That's why I couldn't understand how you reacted to this. Hopefully things will improve as the evening goes on. So the ethos is communal and participatory. It's designed to unite members of a community, not to divide them, not to separate the musical from the unmusical or the skilled from the unskilled. By the way, this is one of the things that John Blacken, whom I mentioned earlier, was very struck by when he studied in Southern Africa, that the African idea of musicality is that everyone is born musical. So it's not, those Carl Seashore tests that were done in the early part of the 20th century about, who is musical and who is not musical, who can hear perfect fifth and who can't hear. And if you can't hear it, then obviously you're not musical. This doesn't work in the same way in traditional Africa. It's assumed that everyone is musical, but it's also assumed that some people have special skill at drumming or singing or whatever it is. So the scene of music making is a scene that involves all of us. And in fact, even to today, if I am making music and you sit and observe me, I will immediately get suspicious. I'll think there's something wrong, or that you hate me, or that you have an evil plan about me, or something like that. I cannot make music for you simply to observe. This is just not acceptable for a traditional, often small community. Now, of course, I know that things change in the large urban centers, but this is the traditional idea. So this kind of music that I just played you, as I said, it's communal to the core. It's meant to bring people together, not to divide them. This music is not, as I said, is not meant to be contemplated in a detached way, which is not to say that there's nothing to contemplate. There's a great deal to contemplate about the prowess of the instrumentalists, but it's not meant to be contemplated in a detached way, but to be supplemented or indeed completed by your participation. It is almost as if there were gaps left in the music to be filled in by the audience. It's almost as if there was a compositional voice, if you like, that says this music is not complete until you participate in it. This is absolutely critical for understanding this music, and you can see why it's not often put on radio for a long period of time, because it does mean that the music is not crafted simply to be, admired or looked at from a distance, and judged, as you do when you go to your concert. No, it's music that, as I said, has to be completed by your participation in it. So that's one of the features. A second feature, this simply has to do with the form. Now, many traditional Africans have devised a very simple but effective way of organizing communal singing. In this case, you heard a lead singer, a male, who called out certain verses, and then a women's chorus responded. So this very simple call and response format has been used with a lot of variation in various African communities. Now, I know that there are probably historians here who always want to know things about origins and so on. Did we invent call and response? Did we borrow it from somewhere? I don't know the answer to that, okay? So just relax. I cannot tell you who invented call and response. What I do know is that many, many traditional African societies have used the call and response format in very imaginative ways. And that's all I'm interested in here. Instruments. You heard a number of instruments there. There are drums, bells, rattles, and various voices. And I'll talk a little bit more about what they're doing later on. And then the rhythmic texture that you heard, this Agbaja dance, is a polyrhythmic texture. That is one in which several rhythms were unfolding simultaneously. Just to give you an illustration of that, and I'm sorry, we have to do this practically, so I hope you're getting your clap pattern ready. But there was a bell pattern that did something like this. Can you do it? Okay, stop. Yeah. That's enough, but you got the feeling, yeah. Okay, this is an amazing pattern, which I'll talk about a little later, but once you start to think about it, in spite of everything I said about not contemplating these things, we get paid to contemplate them. So I'll explain to you what's going on, because it's quite a remarkable little pattern. So you heard that pattern, that was one, and then there was a clap pattern, a much simpler one. Easier, right? Good. Good. All right, fine. I promise these will be very brief participatory moments here. Okay, so those two unfold simultaneously. And when you start piling on the rhythms like that, you get what we call a polyrhythmic texture. So these are basic features that are found in numerous African repertoires. Now, let me move on to the nature of this rhythmic imagination that is supposed to be the title of my lecture. So I said earlier on that rhythm has to do with a general time or temporal aspect of music. And there seem to be, broadly speaking, two kinds of rhythm, or two origins of rhythm, if you like. One is a set of rhythms that come from speech. And then another is a set of rhythms that come from the body. These are the two main kinds of rhythm that circulate in various African communities. And let me just illustrate each of those with your help. So let's start with the rhythms of speech or spoken language. One of the things you find in many small African communities is greeting. We greet one another. And so we're going to greet one another in my language. So all you have to do here, no swear words, I promise, is just say back what I say. All right? Loyami. Areo. Boreo. Mosekra. Ise. Ngbesekra. Iselo. Mirekukaku. Arakufokbe. Midoka karabra. That wasn't funny. I'm thanking you for the work that you've done. Obviously, you didn't do any work, so you found it funny. Okay, but what's going on here? We're exchanging greetings, and actually we needed two people to do this, in the sense that one was a call and one was a response. But Loyami, I greet you. Arreo, did you sleep well? Loreo, I slept well. Mo Sikra, how is where you are coming from? In other words, your home or wherever you came from, or the pub. Ise, Ngbesekra, how is here? Iselo, Mireku Kaku, did you sleep well with morning? This is something that is obligatory for people who live in small communities who are always remembering those who have departed and knowing that when somebody departs, somebody works on your behalf. So it's important to acknowledge that. That's when you burst out into laughter. You are the ones doing the work. You are the ones doing the work. Okay. But notice that although this is a simple ritual greeting, it carries a slight periodic sense. You know, loyami, areo, boreo, mosekra. In other words, it departs slightly from ordinary speech. You know, so the rhythms that you're getting in a greeting are rhythms on their way to song, if you like. You know, on their way to something else. They're not the ordinary rhythms of speech as such. They're slightly marked, but they're not yet in a fully metricized situation as song. Here's another example, a town crier announcement. And this particular example, I'll play the recording for you from the village of Akpafu Toji. One of the things that happens among the Akpafu, and this happens in many other parts of Africa, is that a town crier, a designated town crier, will often make announcements to people about something that's going to happen. So the town crier will come, beat on his bell, and then tell people what they're supposed to do, beat on the bell again. Now, when the town crier is crying, so to speak, you're supposed to be quiet and listen. So here's an example of a town crier announcement. And the reason I'm playing this is just to show you, again, some of these rhythms that come out of speech. They're sort of asymmetrically formed, okay, but they're not yet song. They're not yet music. Okay, they're on their way, so to speak. Okay, so let's do this announcement. Kade loyami oa. You're supposed to speak, say it. Okay. So, this is, I'm not giving you a lot of ethnographic data here because, and I hope you don't mind, because I think it will probably just confuse you. Sometimes people get very upset when we talk about Africa, and as I've been doing so far, I've mentioned Ewe, I mentioned Akpafu, but I'm not dwelling on these ethnic designations. Well, many of these ethnic designations don't originate with us. They came from outside. But the other thing is that where for some people, the ethnic designation gives you a kind of specificity, it's a false comfort specificity because the greetings are greetings that you would find in many, many communities. So if I started to list, we're talking now of a continent with something like 2,000 languages, not counting dialects. So if you really want to be precise, if you want to be scholarly about it, I could take probably 15 minutes just listing the number of ethnic groups that have this. This would defeat the point. So I hope you'll bear with me if you're dying for some ethnographic specificity because you have certain lacks in you. I will overlook that. Okay, so this announcement then. Kadelo yami oa. This was not as enthusiastic as the previous greeting. Phrases slightly longer, but I thought you would have gotten there by now. Kadelo yami oa. Similo siminolo. Kramo pakobo piame. Soja ere marre. Imarongo. So krankade kukaya. Wasara tribono amane oa. Wasara tribono amane oa. Yeah. So you have more memory than you think you do, actually. And one of the reasons I like to say these things and have you repeat them is just so that you get a feel for the sound of the language. Because these languages we're talking about, and most of the indigenous African languages, are tone languages. And some of you will know about tone languages. That is to say, languages in which the relative pitch at which you say things affects the meaning. So when we did the greeting, I said, loyami, right? Loyami, I greet you. But if I said loyami, it's a completely different sentence. Loyami was the first one. Loyami. Loyami means I bought you. You're all my slaves. That's what it means. Just by changing the tone. So you can imagine that speakers of tone languages live in this world, if you like, of heightened pitch awareness. This is not necessarily something that people theorize daily. The 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds do it. Anyway, so it's very natural to them. But I think it's important sometimes just to get a feel for the language, even if you don't speak the language. So here's the announcement that we just did, that properly performed. Town crier. So this is to arrest people's attention. They're supposed to freeze when this happens. Listen to what he has to say. Does it again, just in case you're tempted to move. And then he'll speak now. Okay, and that's the end of that's the end of that announcement. So what did he say? He said, "Kadelo yami, I'm greeting you. Similo, keep quiet and listen. The chief has just come and sent me. So to tell the men, always the men first, Ima Rongo and the women, so kaya that tomorrow morning we will gather at the village square to hear what I have to say." So this is an announcement about a forthcoming announcement. It was not supposed to be funny. Here's another example. But again, you heard, I think, and I don't need to go analytically into detail there, but you heard the segments in which that announcement was delivered. They're uneven segments. And as I say, this is language on its way to music. We'll get to music in a second, but I did want to play you just a little snippet of a lament. This one from the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire, by a woman, a Dan of the Dan ethnic group. She's a Zole, that is a midwife, and a performer of excision operations. By that, we mean female excision of what people call, I guess, genital mutilation and so on. Anyway, this is a woman who is singing to the memory of her dead husband. She is, you'll hear the sort of emotion in her voice. But notice, again, the range of vocal techniques that she uses. Some of them are little snippets of song. Some of them come very close to spoken language. Some of them are somewhere in between. I'll just play you a little bit of this lament by this woman from the Dan ethnic group. Okay, sorry, I wish I could continue with that one. I don't speak the Dan language, so I can't tell you what she's saying. Although the ethnographer who recorded this, Hugo Zemp, a French ethnographer, writes about this. She's obviously remembering, as I said, her husband who's passed away, remembering some of the sort of valiant things that he did in his life. Again, I think you could hear some of the repetitions of words, some of the little song-like snippets, alongside something more declamatory and so on. See, so rhythm is where the theme I'm developing here is really a rather complicated sense of rhythm. In other words, a range of rhythmic behaviors, some of them approaching something with a tactus, some of them approaching something more freely organized. And this is really, I think, the sense in which we should be meaningfully talking about African rhythm. Okay, so much for the rhythms of speech or spoken language. Let me now say something about the rhythms of the body, the ones that emanate from the body, because these are the ones that I think people are most interested in when they're thinking about African music. When I say the rhythms of the body, I mean that they emanate from dance. And these rhythms tend to be symmetrical, divisive, or divisive, I don't know how you say it. Okay, so there are three facets to this, and I'm going to run through these very quickly, and that will probably be all that I'll have time for tonight. And all of them have to do with West African ensemble drumming. And so I'm thinking of groups in Nigeria, like the Igbo or the Yoruba, or in Benin, or even in Togo, or in Ghana, or in the Cote d'Ivoire, where that woman was from. You find ensembles that do the kind of thing that I'm about to describe. Okay, so the three facets of rhythm. The first one is a phenomenon that we've now been calling timeline. The timeline has nothing to do with chronology or with what came before what. Timeline in this usage is simply a short rhythmic figure, often has a very distinct shape, which serves as a reference point for a given dance. Okay, that's all. A rhythmic figure, usually it'll have a kink or it'll have something distinctive about it, and it'll be often played by a bell, and it serves, as I say, as a point of reference for a given dance. So we're going to do some timelines, and then we'll listen to some. Here's a simple one. Yeah? Okay, you're getting late already. But anyway, that's all there is to it. Dum, 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 dum. Now I could vary this. Dum, 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 dum. Yeah? You can tell that that's just a variant of the first one that I did. Okay. So how would it be if I play you the thing itself? Bell, second bell joins. So that's a timeline, that rhythmic pattern. You're going to hear it all the way through this dance. Those are elephant horns that you'll hear. They come in sporadically. Eventually you'll hear hand clap, you're hearing it. Then drums. So it's a polyrhythmic texture. But it's a timeline that I want you to focus on. You see what I was telling you, that this is not music you can contemplate. You have to be doing something in order to find your place in the music. Because otherwise you're wondering, well, this is all. So when Mr. Kinslake was talking about stagger them and put one at cross purposes, there is nothing that's working at cross purposes here. If you have a place in the music, there's nothing that's working against it. You're challenged sometimes. You have to be very disciplined to play this kind of music. But it's all very coherent and very intelligently imagined. Anyway, that rhythmic pattern, pam, 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 which you can do on your way home, is the timeline. Let's take another example of a timeline. This one you'll find not only in African music, but you'll find in Afro-Cuban music, for example. And I'll start off by just generating it. So a simple 4, you don't have to do this with me, just watch 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So we start with that. That's easy enough. Everyone can do this. You can walk to it. Okay, how about if I subdivide 3? So 1, 2, and 3, 4. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. 1. That's also easy. 1, and 2, and... What about this? Pam, pa, pam, 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 pam. Pam, pa, pam, 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 pam. That's also easy. But here's the twist. Pam, 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 pam. You see how I got there? Okay. The previous one was pam, pa, pam, 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 pa, pam, 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 pam. And now I suppressed the onsets of some of the beats. So instead of pam, pa, pam, 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 I just wham, pam, 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 pam. But you can hear the sort of generative element in the background. So this one is a common one. I'll play you just a couple of examples. There it is. Played by the bell pattern. Pa, 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 pa. Pa, 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 pa. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And another one. another manifestation. Pa, 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 pa. Yeah? This you may have heard. Yeah? Okay. Now, this you won't have heard. I promised that I would play you a little bit of art music. So here is a Ghanaian composer, died just a couple of years ago, Robert Kwame, who uses the same timeline, this clave pattern, as a basis for a piano piece. And this is what that sounds like. It's a piano. You're happy. Pa, 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 pa. So on. Okay, I wish I could play you the whole thing. There's a CD out that you can get on Amazon that has that. But an example of an art music composer using a timeline. Okay, and I told you if you listen to the ethnomusicologists, you'll never know that this kind of thing happens. Okay, and the last of the timelines that I just want to play is the one actually that we started with, the one that I made you do, pam, pam, pa, pam, 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 pa, pam, pam, which you couldn't do, and I was very discouraged at that point. Well, this one is one that in the literature we now call the standard pattern. Okay. Just writing this out, I don't mean to get overly technical here, but this is one of the most enduring rhythmic patterns that you'll find on the African continent. It's a timeline. It has no real fixed name because, of course, different communities call it by different things, or they don't call it by any name at all. It's just what the bell plays when we make ensemble music, okay? But the reason it has become interesting for a lot of us is that it has certain properties. There are 7 attack points within a total span of 12, okay? And so it turns out that if you're interested, and I'll just tell you what some of these structural properties are. The construction seems to be asymmetrical. So you have long, long, short, long, 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 short. See, if we had had long, long, short, that would have been a repetition, an internal repetition. But no, long, long, short, just when you think you're getting a pattern, long, long, it disrupts it further. Okay, so that's one of the things. The other thing is that if you listen to the pattern, pam pam pa pam 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 pa pam pam pa pam 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 pa pam pam. You don't know where to segment it. It's just an ongoing pattern. You see, it has a dynamism that carries forward. So this is going to just keep going, almost in perpetuity. Just when there's no place to break and rest. Too long, pam pam pam. The short one disrupts that. Pam pam pa pam 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 pa pam. And this one is certainly no place to rest because you're done with your span of 12. So it turns out actually in mathematical terms that these attack points, these 7 attack points, are maximally even in respect to the distribution or their distribution within the 12 span. The other thing that has intrigued some people, and I only offer this to you with some trepidation, is that this pattern is isomorphic with what you call the diatonic scale. Now, everyone who takes a piano lesson or plays an instrument knows do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? You've done that. So now it just so happens that your do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do has a certain interesting properties. It's a 7-note scale, and it has a set of durational patterns. Not the scale. The scale actually has intervals, but if you assume an equivalence between the intervals and the durational pattern, you end up with exactly the same thing. That is to say, this is 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, okay? And in the scale that I'm talking about, between do and re, and mi and fa and so and la and ti and do, you probably don't use those anymore, but this is C, D, E, F, G, and so on. The distance here is 2 semitones, two semitones, one semitones, two semitones, two semitones, two semitones, one semitone. It's exactly the same as the rhythmic pattern. Now, I say I offer this to you with some trepidation because I don't know whether you can equate semitones with durational patterns, because one is in the pitch domain, the other is in the temporal domain. So I don't know whether you can do that, but it makes a very nice story, doesn't it? See, the good Lord in his wisdom gave the diatonic scale to the Europeans and then gave the rhythmic scale, or its equivalent, to the Africans. Actually, sadly, he also gave us the diatonic scale because we also use it in Africa. So it doesn't work quite as well. But there are other things. If there's another thing, and I'll just mention this briefly, if you take this pattern, this is the most technical I'm going to get, don't worry. If you take this pattern and you rotate it, you'll get a lot of invariance. That is to say that the patterns keep repeating. So here we started pam, pam, pa, pam, 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 pa. But I could start it from here, pam, 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 pa, pam, pam, pa. If I started from here, you see? That is to say, this becomes the next point. And you can actually take each one of them and rotate it. That's what I mean. And you'll see that there's a very high degree of invariance. So anyway, that's the kind of thing music theorists get interested in. All I'm saying is that this apparently simple, straightforward rhythmic pattern that you find in all these African communities, Central African Republic, you'll find them among the Banda Linda, they're doing exactly the same thing. In Zambia, you'll find it. You find in the central, in Zaire, and so on. This pattern is an enduring pattern, I think, because it has these very, very special properties. It has no one name, as I said, although we've been calling it the standard pattern. So I think my time is almost up. Let me play you just a couple of uses of this standard pattern. So here's one example from the Southern Ave. Sorry, I have to do it because of the recording. Here's another one, not because I want to entertain you any other way. Here's another example. Little call before it starts. And so on. Okay, sorry, I have to cut that one short. That was the same song that we heard at the very beginning, just a different performance of it, but obviously you missed it. And one last example of that same pattern, this one also in an art music realm. Now, this is a Nigerian composer. We call him Fred O. That's because his last name is so long that nobody knows how to pronounce it. He's quite happy to be called O. That's the first letter of his last name. Anyway, Fred O wrote an etude for piano using the standard pattern. I'll play that for you as the last of my examples. So that's the pattern. See, you won't hear this from the ethnomusicologists. They don't want you to know that somebody's fantasizing about this rhythm. It's writing a piano piece. So on. This one too you can get on Amazon. So there we go. So anyway, that gives you just a taste of the standard pattern. If you were at an Agbaja performance, probably you would hear the pattern 6,000 times, 7,000 times. You might take a break somewhere in the middle. But whoever plays the bell had better be secure because the rest of the ensemble depends on that level of security. I've run out of time. I can't talk about polyrhythm and the lead drummer's rhythmic narratives. Maybe you'll invite me back someday, and then we'll get into those. But just to finish off, a couple of points. Maybe these could set up the discussion. One, I think we can agree. I hope anyway that Africans have developed very clever, very effective ways of ordering time in music. Even in the absence of writing, or maybe especially because of the absence of writing. We can debate that. Another thing that I would like to put forward for discussion is that the African approach to rhythm is holistic. It's not atomistic. It's not scattered into separate elements. Now, when we did this, we did a little analysis and I was breaking it down. Clearly, the musicians who are playing this music don't think in these terms. In fact, they never count rhythms, you know. You don't count, say 1, 2, 3, go. Nobody ever says that. If they do that, it's probably an American tourist who is there. Or that is just not part of the indigenous pedagogy. In fact, one of the reasons, sorry, just a little parenthesis, but I just feel inspired to tell you stories tonight. But one of the reasons you can't do that in a language like Ewe is that the words for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are not one-syllable words as you have them in English, but they're two-syllable words. So in order for me to say 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, I would have to say dekaive, 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 dekaive. You see, that's utterly ridiculous. So it tells you that you can't count in this. There's some other ways in which you reckon these things. Anyway, so the approach is holistic. It involves many things drawn together. We work with shapes, with gestalts. We don't count beats, and so on. Another thing that I didn't really have a lot of time to talk about, although I mentioned it in passing, is the close connection between language and music. And again, this is one of the areas in which we've lost a lot of very valuable information because so few ethnographers actually spend the time learning wonderful languages. When I say wonderful languages, I mean the indigenous African languages. I don't mean Swahili, sorry, languages like that. So this close connection, you know, it's something that I think is very well worth pursuing. And then the final thing that I just mentioned is the way in which rhythm is a kind of embodiment. The body expresses the rhythm of the dance. Therefore, dance or some sort of embodiment is critical to a correct interpretation of African rhythm. Many of the theorists who wrote about African rhythm, some of the quotations that I wrote to you, would have gotten things right if they had danced to the music or if they had watched people dancing to the music. Because it was through the body that the rhythm is, as it were, domesticated. That's how you express the meaning of the rhythm. But if you stand back detached, you're going to get a mass of data, and you're going to start imagining that this thing is far more complicated than it is. So I'll stop there, and maybe if you have questions or comments, we can discuss it. Thank you. Yes.
There are two things that I'd like to comment. One is that many of these rhythms sound very much South American to us, or Latin American. I don't know whether the influence from Africa went to Latin America to create these rhythms. And the second was whether you would say something about talking drums.
Yeah. Well, yes. A number of these rhythms are part of, if you like, the African legacy in the New World. That I think has been known, but I'm now talking about often small communities where some of the religious so there's a kind of religious baggage that goes with it. So it's not merely that any rhythm that you find in South Africa is actually, in South America is actually an African import, but there are very specific contexts of that. So candomblé, for example. There are places in Jamaica where you have some of these rhythms that are there. But what you should remember, though, that it's not a one-way trade. In the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of Cuban music that made its way back to Africa to places like Zaire, where sukus and a lot of sort of Zairean popular music was, in a sense, refertilized by music coming from the New World. So the clave pattern, for example, that I played you, the one that goes tam, 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 tam. Now, I don't know whether I could say for sure that this was a more African thing than a New World thing. In fact, I think it's really undecidable that way. So the trade gets complicated, but in the first instance, obviously, it's part of these rhythms are part of the baggage that was brought to the New World. As for talking drums, yes, I could talk at length about them, but I won't. Just to say that the basic principle of talking drums is for a drum to reproduce the patterns of speech on a drum, you know. So you've seen those so-called dun-dun drums that are held under armpits and played, and you squeeze them to vary the pitch, you see. It's not just the pitch, but it's also the actual rhythm that's important. Or you will have seen larger drums that are used for communicating. And the principle was very simple. What you would say is reproduced on the drum. Now, when you have a drum, you don't have the benefits of the kinds of articulation that you have in spoken language. So without the benefit of your consonants and vowels, you're left with high and low, you see? So if you say, "Memamatnase," nanane impenyon for, okay? Now, when I say it in speech, this is the Akan language, "Memamatnase," nanane impenyon for. Well, I have enough things to make these discriminations. But if I play it on a drum, it will sound like this. Ta 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 ta, ta 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 ta. You see? How are you going to know that I'm saying Memamatnase? Well, that's you know that if you know that you're supposed to know it. That is to say, you know, there's a lot of mythology about talking drums in the sense that this is an exchange among people who partly know in what context certain things are said, and that there's a limited number of things that you say. So, for example, the Akan talking drum language, according to Nketia, who's an authority on this, has no more than 500 words. You see, imagine a language with 500 words. But 500 words is quite adequate for you to talk about, you know, a war, or somebody who is misbehaving, or a death, or the arrival of the district commissioner, so some British guy being carried in a hammock, or something like that. It's quite adequate. So the context enables you, I think, to make those distinctions. So yes, the basic principle is simply you transfer speech patterns onto drums, talking drums, but actually there are other factors that intervene. And let me just also add that actually in principle, every instrument can talk. You see, for some reason, we always talk about drums talking. Flutes can talk. You know, you can do things with flutes which approximate the pattern of speech. So you can communicate fully freighted language on other instruments. It just so happens that some of the people who wrote about these things early on were particularly fascinated by drums. Yeah. And we come back again to language, because language is so important. And in fact, some people would say, not just me, but Kubik, for example, Gerhard Kubik, who is an Austrian who's been living in a suitcase in Malawi for the last 50 years, Kubik will tell you that without understanding African languages, you cannot understand African music. He thinks ultimately that's really what's going on. So you have to wonder when you see people in Central Park playing these instruments, no idea what is being said or what the linguistic sensibility is that produced that music. You have to feel sorry for them. Yes, sir.
What's the role of improvisation, or how improvisational is African music?
That was going to be my last example. There is room for improvisation because there's always room for composing in a moment, for showing, you know, your ability to decorate things and so on. All within limits, though. All within limits. And so I think in general, if you have an ensemble, like the ensemble that played the Agbaja dance that I have used as an example, the bell, the rattle, and the support drums, we call them, play something that is relatively fixed. Then there is somebody called, in the literature, it used to be called the master drummer. Again, a term that Africans don't use. A lead drummer, that would be more in sync with the way we think about that role. So the lead drummer would be the person who has more improvisational freedom, you see. So in a dance like Agbaja, you would start off with, the bell pattern that you guys did, and then the rattle and so on. The lead drummer would come in, and depending on his mood, depending on the rapport that he's having with the dancers and so on, would begin to expose set rhythmic patterns. I call them narratives. They're rhythmic narratives, not necessarily narratives that are aligned with language, but they're narratives in the realm of tone and rhythm and so on. So there's a certain amount of that. Having said that, though, let me just say that there are a number of people who have mistaken pre-composed African music for improvisation. And so some of our colleagues who've been working on improvisation have tried to show us that, in fact, what we thought was being improvised was actually something that was being calculated in terms of certain procedures. Now, those procedures, and I'm talking now about some work that was done on an Akan, it's a funeral dance called Adwa, which the Ashanti perform. It was something that emerged actually in the 1880s, and it's very common now. You can't go to an Ashanti funeral without encountering Adwa. It's a very graceful dance. If you listen to the lead drummer in that, he'll sound as if he's improvising something. But in fact, people who've worked on this have noticed that the lead drummer actually works with sets, you see, sets of patterns. So they're working within a modulus of 12. And if they give you, say, 8 out of the 12, they know that they have something left over to do, you see. So if he's going ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, that's a complete pattern. Later on, he'll go ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta. But you're waiting for ta-ta-ta, the response, aren't you? Yeah. But he can suspend that for quite a while before he gives it to you. Well, just a simple principle of complementation, because he has a set. The set has to be complete. He won't leave it, he won't give it to you in a truncated form. There's a lot of intellectual, if you want to call that intellectual, it's a lot of that goes on in traditional drumming. It will sound to you as if, well, they're just doing this, they're having fun, and, they're not wearing any shirts, so that makes it even more interesting. It's not that at all. Yeah, sorry.
I lived in Kenya for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, then this is where we get into some of the complications of, if you like, the vast range of stylistic influences on African music. Because actually on the East Coast and down, if you just go down Kenya all the way down South Africa, you'll find an interesting mixture of cultures there. You'll find a Middle Eastern influence. Some people believe you have an Indonesian influence there. And then you have something we call a traditional African influence. And yes, it is true that not everyone drums. You're surprised to hear that even in West Africa, it's not everyone who drums. And what does that tell you about the sort of sensationalizing of the drum as being a sort of, African instrument par excellence? And again, I say, actually, if you want to essentialize anything, it's song that you should essentialize, because most communities will have something invested in song, but not in drumming. So what you're saying is absolutely correct. It gets more complicated if you look at the sort of, the sort of Islamic, Arabic influenced areas all across West Africa, the so-called Mande areas, or even among a group like the Yoruba, whom we think of as being sort of traditionally African. And then you find that there's a lot of influence from elsewhere. I think if we start to unravel some of these stylistic deposits, in various African traditions, the thing looks very, very complicated. Yeah. Yes.
Are there many differences or similarities depending on the country? That is, could you, you as a person that knows, could you say if you listen to something, this is from this country or this is from that other country? Or are they very much much similar?
Well, again, that depends, I have to say. First of all, the country divisions, the so-called nation states, are not our divisions. As you know, they're sort of
We
colonial.
learned that in
You learned that, okay. So a more reliable grouping is the ethnic group. So the Ebe, for example, my group, you find them in Ghana, you find them in Togo, you find them in Benin, and you find their relatives even in Western Nigeria, the so-called Gbe languages, okay? And there are certain repertoires that cut across these languages. So in that sense, I could tell you with about 70% confidence that if I heard music from Togo that was in Gengbe, for example, that I would recognize that and know its affiliation immediately with Ebe music. And it would be true also of Fon music, you know. There's some genres that you can tell, not everyone though. So that would be one way in which you can recognize these things. But there's another level at which you can talk about similarities. For example, music from the Central African Republic, the so-called Banda Linda ethnic group. Well, some of the procedures are very similar to the procedures that you find in Ghana, say. And yet, you know, the Central African Republic, as you know, is a French-speaking country, Ghana, English-speaking, and so on. And so they've had sort of separate histories, at least since about 1960, so to speak.
I'm not talking about the language. I know that there are differences.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the rhythm.
Yeah. It depends on the level at which you want to make the discrimination and what is exactly you want to use to make that discrimination. For example, if you say the presence of polyrhythm, you know, is your marker, well, you're going to find many traditions that use some polyrhythmic procedure. But you need a little bit more than that because invariably those things involve dance, they involve some kind of song, and so it's sort of hard to bracket off the language, you know, as part of that. I would say, you know, that this is a sort of old argument, you know, African music, one or many, you know, it's a good examination question. And of course the students say, well, it depends on your point of view. Of course it depends on what your point of view. What I would probably say is that it's generally difficult to confuse African music with some other world music. In other words, if you put African music alongside Indonesian music, Asian music, you know, European folk music, the African difference to me is quite evident. So in that sense, there is something essential there. I'm treading on very dangerous territory here. There's something essential there. On the other hand, I don't know whether I could always tell you with a piece of Ivorian music that this is Ivorian and not Togolese. Some of that just simply happens to be the fact that I haven't done the kind of extensive ethnographic work that would enable me to tell that. So I don't know these repertoires intimately. But some of it is a there are genuine similarities. And if, as I say, if you bracket up the language, then you're left with sounds that could be, you know, that could sound similar. So I'm not helping you very much with this, but I think it's a complicated question. Yeah, over there.
There's a lot of exciting West African music coming into the state, particularly the clubs in New York, like SOBs. Is this music that's been versatized to suit Western ears? Or if I went to such as Mali or Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, would I hear the same type of music being played there?
Yeah, you would hear some of that music being played there. This is a phenomenon that's undeniable that the so-called popular music, which I haven't talked about today, which has been a huge phenomenon in the 20th century. It's mostly something confined to urban Africa, where the music that I was talking about is actually very much a rural thing. And so the music that you're talking about is urban. It's music that's helped along by recording and also by radio and TV and so on, by the media, you know. Some of it, I mean, you know, it's best if you're talking about specific, you know, personalities who travel the world, they go to Europe and they come here. well, yes, of course, then you would hear this music. But there's also a fair amount of it now that is being made without humans. So, for example, in Ghana, there is a new phenomenon we call hip life, which we say is a combination of high life and hip hop. Okay, and it's all this is sort of manufactured by 17, 18-year-olds who want to be stars overnight. You will never go and hear hip life, or generally, you will not hear hip life performed live. So much for the life of the hip life. But you could buy it on cassettes and CDs and so on. So yeah, it's a broad range of things. There are the big stars who go out and perform this music and make lots and lots of money. I think that if there is a loss, it is a linguistic loss ultimately. Sorry, have you had a talk on language? Because I seem to be on this kick. But if there's a loss, that's the erosion that's taking place. All of what comes from language, whether it's just a sensibility, whether it's meaning, whether it's affect, all of that I think is being lost. And just a little anecdote, although it's been some years, when Bob Marley died, there was some expectation that an African musician would, as it were, fill the void. That is an equally popular African music at the time. And the person that most people thought would do that was King Sunny Ade of Juju music fame. You probably never heard of him. But anyway, Sunny Ade was sort of very quickly brought in and recording contracts signed. It didn't work. Well, why? Because the Juju music that Sunny Ade plays is very deeply steeped in Yoruba lore. The sound of the language, there's something very mellow about it. It's not leaping up and down. It's almost opaque to the listener. It's very pleasant from a distance, but the depth of meaning there will not communicate if you don't have access to the linguistic dimension. So that had to explain why that failed, or at least one of the reasons why it failed. Sorry, I deviated from your question, but you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, with communication the way it is, and travel, and the world opening up, isn't there a lot of Western influence on the African music today?
Yeah, there is, and but the Western influence on African music goes back to some of the earliest contacts between Westerners, whether they were Portuguese or especially in the 19th century, down when the missions all started in the 1840s and so on, and you start teaching people to sing hymns and so on, you're going to get that kind of harmonic language in the popular music. So high life music, which I didn't play you today, for example, you can't imagine it without imagining tonics and dominants and subdominants that came from the Protestant hymn. There is more recently, with American imperialism, there's a lot of American influence also, because this is what people hear. And it's not just in the musical realm, but in say in the religious realm. So you can see, if you happen to be in Ghana, just go on TV, and some Sunday evening there'll be some evangelist, who has obviously sold his tapes for free to the GBC, and they have nothing to broadcast on Sunday evening, so they put it there. And it's a package of not just you're going to go to heaven, but also that here's a music that will take you there. So that influence is there. If we started to sort it out, well, it would take us a very long time. But what I do want to say is that, for me, a discourse of origins, you see, is actually, as far as music is concerned, and maybe in other realms of expression, it might be different. But as far as music is concerned, a discourse of origins is ultimately not very interesting. What is interesting is the kind of creativity that's being exercised, Because otherwise you're going to say, well, I gave you that 5-1 progression, so forever we will say that this came. But if you watch some of these guitarists and the way in which they found, the kind of interesting things that they found to do, you're not going to keep saying that, well, the guitar didn't originate in Africa, therefore we cannot credit any creativity there. So it's not to our advantage, speaking as an African now, to keep insisting on the discourse of origins. You know, we can let the geneticists and others do their thing and tell you about that. But as far as artistic expression is concerned, people have done incredibly interesting things using resources that they got from elsewhere. The West has done the same thing, you know. So I don't know why we should be deprived of that. So I think there was some from this side, or okay, yeah. Okay. Sorry.
It reminds me of the tonal language. In a tonal language, what happens to a tone deaf person? You can't tell the difference. Is there any difference?
Gee, you got me there. I didn't hear you. Sorry, just kidding. Well, presumably, a tone. I actually, when I was growing up, there was a young man who was a deaf mute in my community, and we seemed to do okay communicating. He could see, of course, so obviously he could see the movements of your lips, and then you supplement that with other signs. And when the
somebody who can actually hear, but doesn't have the ability to differentiate among tones.
yeah, well.
I used to listen to my father sing in church, sing hymns. He thought he was singing, but
Yes.
his voice just went on one line.
Yes. You know, I actually never thought of that in any kind of systematic way. I would have to find out and tell you what happens. Yes, absolutely, yeah. And there are languages with many, many more tones than we do, I think. You know, languages with 14 tones, some with 11. I mean, I speak one with 3, and I know another that has 4, but that's bad enough. But no, I don't know what happens with people like that. I would have to find out, yes.
Thank you very much.